The boarding house kitchen was stifling hot that spring evening in 1883, the wood stove blazing even though the sun had not yet set over the Dakota Territory. Martha Henson wiped a strand of damp hair from her forehead with the back of her hand, the flour on her apron leaving a white smudge across her cheek. She was stirring a pot of beans, the steam curling around her face, when she heard the raised voices from the dining room, men arguing, chairs scraping, and above it all, the clipped, irritated tone of the cattle baron, Victor Laurent. Through the cracked door, she could see the long table covered in papers and maps. Victor sat at the head, his suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up. Across from him sat Damien Cross, the scout he had brought all the way from Cheyenne, a man who claimed to speak Spanish like a native. The local ranchers, old Thomas and 3 others, sat stiff and uncomfortable, their weathered hands resting on the table. Martha had learned Spanish years ago from her late husband Carlos, a vaquero who had taught her the language of his childhood under the wide Texas sky. When he died of fever 2 years past, she had been left with a 4-year-old daughter, a small cabin on the edge of town, and a job as a cook and maid at the Diamond Hotel. The pay was meager, $1.50 a week, but it kept a roof over little Junie's head and food in their bellies. She worked from before dawn until after dusk, and every night she fell into her narrow bed with aching feet and a heart full of love for the child who slept beside her. Now, as Damien spoke, Martha felt the blood drain from her face. He was not translating Victor's words accurately. Victor had said, "I offer fair prices and a share of the profits. I want this partnership to benefit every family in this valley." Damien translated it as, "He says you are greedy peasants who will take whatever he gives. His terms are final." The ranchers exchanged dark glances. Old Thomas leaned forward and said something in Spanish, a polite question about the water rights. Damien translated it as a threat. "Thomas says if you try to cheat them, they will burn your wagons." Victor slammed his hand on the table. The coffee cups rattled. "I came here in good faith," he shouted, his face reddening. "If this is how you treat a partner, then this deal is dead." The ranchers began to rise. Martha's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She knew that if the deal collapsed, the whole valley would suffer. No new roads, no schoolhouse, no steady work for the men who had been struggling through the long drought. But if she spoke up, she would lose her job. Mr. Grimshaw, the hotel owner, had a hard rule. Servants do not interfere with guests. She thought of Junie, asleep in the tiny room upstairs. She thought of the unpaid bill at the mercantile. Mrs. Pritchard had given her 1 more week, but her patience was thin. She thought of the beans she had saved on the stove for tomorrow's breakfast, the only meal she could afford. And then she thought of Carlos, who had always said that a lie left unchallenged was a poison that would rot the soul. The decision came like a splash of cold water. She pushed open the door. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to her. A dusty cook, in a flour-stained apron, her face flushed with heat and fear. Victor looked at her with irritation. "This is a private meeting," he said curtly. Martha swallowed. Her throat felt dry as dust. "Mr. Laurent," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "your scout is lying." For a moment, no one moved. Then Damien laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. "This woman is clearly confused," he said. "I have been translating perfectly for hours." Martha met Victor's eyes, steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I speak Spanish, sir. My husband was a vaquero. I learned from him. I heard everything that man said. He changed your words to make them sound like threats. He told the ranchers that you called them ignorant peasants, that you planned to steal their land. That is not what you said." Victor's face went pale. He turned to Damien, who had stopped laughing. "Is this true?" Victor demanded. Damien stammered. "She is a lying cook, sir. She doesn't know what she's saying." But Victor was already calling for the telegraph operator, who happened to have a cousin visiting from Santa Fe. Within an hour, the independent interpreter confirmed everything Martha had said. The truth was undeniable. Damien had been paid by a rival cattle operation to sabotage the deal. The scout was escorted out by the sheriff, his protests fading into the dusk. The ranchers, stunned and relieved, shook hands with Victor. A new agreement was drawn, fair and honest. Marta stood in the corner, trembling, waiting for the worst. She had done the right thing, but the cost was already whispering in her ear. Mr. Grimshaw did not disappoint. That very night, he came to the kitchen with a hard face. "Get your things and get out," he said. "I don't want troublemakers in my establishment. You have until morning." Martha said nothing. She packed her few belongings, a worn shawl that Carlos had given her on their first anniversary, a tin cup, a small Bible with a cracked leather cover, and woke Junie, who was groggy and confused. "Mama, where are we going?" "Home, sweetheart," Martha whispered, taking her hand. They walked through the dark streets under a cold spring wind. The cabin was dark when she lit the single kerosene lamp. The flour bin was nearly empty, just a handful of grainy dust left. The woodpile was low, only 3 logs. Junie looked up at her with trusting eyes. "Mama, are we in trouble?" "No, sweetheart," Martha said, forcing a smile. "We're fine." But that night, after Junie had fallen asleep on the thin mattress, Martha sat at the table and cried silent tears. The weight of her sacrifice pressed down on her chest like a stone. She had done the right thing, and she had lost everything for it. The kerosene lamp flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. She wondered how she would feed her daughter tomorrow. She thought of the beans she had left behind on the stove, the only food she had. She thought of the $4 she owed the mercantile. She thought of the winter coat Junie would need in a few months. And she wondered, in the deepest part of her heart, if doing the right thing had been worth the cost. The next morning, a knock came at the door. Marta opened it to find a man she had seen at the meeting. A quiet, broad-shouldered cowboy with kind eyes and a calm voice. He was Victor Laurent's foreman, a man named Silas Ward. He held his hat in his hands, his boots dusty from the trail. "Mrs. Henson," he said, tipping his head. "Mr. Laurent heard about what happened at the hotel. He's taken a room at the boarding house across town, and he'd like to offer you a position. He needs someone who can cook for his crew and help with translations when they deal with the Mexican ranchers. The pay is good, $3 a week, and a cottage on the ranch for you and your daughter." Martha stared at him. She could not speak. No one had ever come to her rescue before. The words would not form in her throat. Silas shifted his weight, looking at the ground, then back at her. "Can you cook?" he asked, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. It was the same question Carlos had asked her when they first met, at a church social in Laramie. She had laughed then and said, "I can make biscuits that would make a man weep." Carlos had laughed too, and she had known she was loved. Now, standing in the cold morning light, Martha felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "I can cook." Silas nodded. "Then pack your things. I'll bring the wagon around." She packed again, and within a week, she and Junie were settled into a cozy cottage on the Laurent ranch. It was small. A single room with a wood stove, a bed, a table, and 2 chairs. But it was clean, and the windows faced east, catching the morning sun. Marta rose before dawn each day to light the stove, made biscuits and gravy for the cowhands, baked bread every other day, and had a hot supper waiting at dusk. Her kitchen became the heart of the bunkhouse. The men spoke to her with respect, and little Junie played in the yard with the ranch pups. And Silas was often the last to leave the table. He never said much, but he always thanked her, and sometimes he would leave a small piece of kindling outside her door, or mend a hinge on her cabinet before she noticed it was broken. One evening, he brought a sack of flour from town and set it by the stove without a word. Marta saw the wear on his hands, the quiet patience in his eyes, and she began to understand that his care was steady, like the rhythm of a rocking chair. Weeks passed. Word spread through the valley about how Martha had exposed the crooked scout. Some women in town, the ones who had always whispered about her being a half-widow, married to a Mexican, now looked at her with grudging respect. But others still gossiped. The biggest talker was Mrs. Pritchard, the mercantile owner's wife, who said Martha had been lucky, not brave, that any illiterate cook could have stumbled into the truth. Martha heard the whispers but said nothing. She had Junie, she had a home, and she had her pride. She poured herself into her work, kneading dough until her arms ached, scrubbing pots until they shone. At night, she read Junie stories from the Bible by lamplight, and the child would fall asleep with her head in Martha's lap. But there were hard days too. One afternoon, Martha looked at her reflection in the small hand mirror, the gray threads in her dark hair, the lines around her eyes, and felt a pang of loneliness. She was only 38, but she felt ancient. She wondered if anyone would ever see her as more than the cook, more than the widow, more than the woman who had been fired from the hotel. She missed Carlos with a sharp ache that never fully healed. Then came the day of the big county fair, where Victor was to announce the final partnership with the ranchers. A stage had been set up in the town square, decorated with bunting and wildflowers. Hundreds of people gathered: ranchers, shopkeepers, farmers, wives and children. Martha stood near the back, holding Junie's hand, feeling out of place in her simple calico dress. The sun was warm, and the air smelled of hay and roasted corn. Victor spoke eloquently about the new cattle drive, the shared resources, the schools and roads that would come. His voice carried across the crowd, confident and generous. Then he paused and looked directly into the sea of faces. "Before we sign," Victor said, "I want to honor the person who made this possible. Without her courage, this deal would have died. Without her honesty, I would have left this valley in anger, and all of you would have missed a chance for prosperity." He looked at Martha. "Mrs. Henson, please come forward." The crowd parted. Martha felt her face burn, but she walked up to the stage, Junie at her side. Victor handed her a small leather pouch. "A payment," he said, "for her service." Then he turned to the crowd. "This woman lost her job because she told the truth. She was cast out with a child and no safety net. But she did not complain. She did not beg. She simply kept going. And now, she is the finest cook in the territory and the most honest interpreter I have ever met." Mrs. Pritchard, standing in the front row, looked at the ground. Her face was red. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Someone started clapping, and soon everyone joined in. Old Thomas took off his hat and nodded at Martha with a look of deep respect. Martha could not speak. She looked down at Junie, who was beaming up at her with tears in her eyes. "Mama," she whispered, "you're a hero." Tears streamed down Martha's face. She had not realized how much she had needed this, to be seen, to be honored, to know that her sacrifice had mattered. She held the pouch in her hands and felt its weight, but it was nothing compared to the lightness in her heart. If this story has touched you so far, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps bring more stories of courage and kindness to people who may need hope today. That night, Martha returned to the cottage to find a fresh loaf of bread on her table, wrapped in a clean cotton cloth. The crust was still warm. Next to it was a note in Silas's careful handwriting. "Can you cook? I think you proved that. Welcome home." She smiled, and for the first time in years, she felt truly seen. Her sacrifice had not been forgotten. Her dignity had not been wasted. And the quiet man who had asked her that simple question, who had given her a chance when no one else would, was waiting for her in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and a promise of tomorrow. She sat down across from him, and they shared the bread in silence, the lamplight casting a warm glow on their faces. Junie was already asleep, her small hand clutching her mother's shawl. The fire crackled softly, and outside the wind whispered through the tall grass. Sometimes the hero who saves the day is not a cattle baron or a rich man. Sometimes it is a widow in a flower-stained apron, brave enough to speak when everyone else stayed silent. And sometimes a single act of courage changes not just one life, but an entire valley. As the last embers of the fire fell, Martha looked across the table at Silas and felt a peace she had not known since Carlos died. She was not forgotten. She was not a burden. She was a woman who had done the right thing, and love had found her anyway. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Your support helps these inspiring stories reach people who may need hope today. Special request: comment below with the words, "Honesty heals." If you believe that the truth, even when costly, always finds a way to bring light,